All right, so today we're going to dive deep into something, well, it's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Pi Network's call auction.
Oh, yeah. That's a...
This is how they're saying they're going to launch Pi, and how they're going to determine the value.
Yeah.
It's unlike anything I've seen before in crypto. So we've got some good info from somebody who's following this closely.
Yeah.
So to kind of set the stage here, what's so interesting about this is that Pi, from the very beginning, has been saying that they're aimed to be a stablecoin.
Right.
Not just another cryptocurrency, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Not just another speculative asset. They're saying this is going to be a stablecoin.
Yeah.
And that's that's a big deal, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially because that's not really how most cryptocurrencies work. So yeah, this call auction is a key part of how they're trying to make that happen.
Right. I mean, think about it. If you want to use Pi to buy something, you don't want the value to be fluctuating wildly.
Rightly, yeah.
Right. That's the whole idea, right?
It defeats the purpose.
Yeah, it defeats the whole purpose of a stable coin.
Yeah.
So before we get ahead of ourselves, though, let's just break down this call auction thing.
Yeah.
It sounds, at least initially, it kind of sounds like you've seen this in stocks and bonds, right?
Right.
Like an auction where you have buyers and sellers kind of determining the price. Is it kind of like that?
Yeah, you're on the right track. But the big thing here is that Pi Network wants to attract what's called FIAT currency. So think, dollars, euros, yen, the money that we use every day, right?
Right.
And they want to make it easy for people to get Pi. So this call auction is going to let people buy Pi with FIAT currency without having to go through the mining process.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So I guess my question then is, if it's an auction, like why wouldn't the open market just determine the initial value of Pi?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. So in this initial phase, Pi's value isn't actually determined by the open market.
Okay.
Instead, there's this process called set the value path.
Hmm.
And this is where the early adopters of Pi, the pioneers as they're called, come to a consensus on what Pi is worth.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like a collective agreement on the initial value.
And is there a number that's kind of thrown around or anything? Like what are we talking here?
Well, this is where it gets even more interesting. So the initial value, like the number that's actually programmed into the call auction, it's set at $314,159 US.
314,000.
314,159.
Whoa. Okay. So that's a pretty bold statement, right out of the gate.
Right.
So I mean, obviously, Pi Network wants to, make sure that everyone plays by the rules.
Hmm.
So I'm assuming there's some kind of vetting process for any exchange that wants to list Pi, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So they've got a pretty strict process. Exchanges have to go through what's called Know Your Business, or KYB.
KYB.
And it's basically, making sure that they meet certain standards, making sure that they're legitimate and all of that. And only then can they list Pi, and they have to, abide by the predetermined rules, including that initial set value.
Okay, so they're really doubling down on this this stablecoin idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it makes you wonder, how can they even do that? Like how can you have a cryptocurrency that's backed by, potentially volatile things like stocks and bonds and still have it be stable?
Yeah, it's a great question. So they're positioning Pi as a type of digital money, a stablecoin that's not just backed by FIAT currency, but also other cryptocurrencies and even potentially stocks and bonds.
Okay.
And so it's a really different approach than your typical cryptocurrency, which, as you know, is usually just driven by speculation.
Right.
And, there's actually code in the Pi network that kind of supports this whole idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Have you heard of the Pi network configuration constants?
Yeah, I've seen that, thrown around. I don't know what that means, though.
Yeah, so these constants are basically they're the nuts and bolts that show how Pi is going to try to maintain its value through this diverse basket of assets.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just, empty promises. There's actually code that shows their intentions. And they argue that, this approach will help make Pi more reliable for everyday use.
Right.
Because, ideally, you don't want to have to worry about your money fluctuating wildly in value.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this call auction. We've got this kind of consensus on a starting value through this set the value path, and we've got the whole stablecoin thing. But there's one more piece to this whole puzzle that I keep hearing about.
Right.
And that's GCV. What is that?
Yeah, so GCV stands for Global Currency Value.
Okay.
And Pi Network really sees this call auction as the way to introduce this concept to the world.
Hmm.
So during the auction, participants can actually adjust the price of pi,
Yeah.
but it's very controlled. They can only adjust it within a very narrow range,
Okay.
somewhere between 0.005% and 1% of that initial 314,159 US dollar value.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about establishing an initial price, but it's also about creating this system
Exactly.
for determining a global currency value.
That's exactly it.
It's like a whole different way of thinking about value.
Right.
So I mean, think about it. If this GCV thing actually takes off, this could have massive implications for how we think about money, how we think about finance, all of that.
Absolutely. It's certainly ambitious.
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of questions. What happens if they can pull this off?
Yeah, what does that world even look like, right?
Right. What would a world where pi is widely used actually look like?
Yeah.
How would that impact the broader economic and financial landscape?
I mean, we're talking about potentially a shift in how we think about currency, on a global scale.
Yeah.
It's pretty mind-blowing. But yeah, it'll certainly be fascinating to see what happens. And we'll definitely be keeping an eye on Pi Network as it develops.